Raid on Pearl. This is no drill. And you can imagine the hair probably stood up on the back of his neck. I mean, there was no more information at the time, but he knew he needed to get that word to Washington, D.C. and all of the commands. So suddenly, he was busy. And as he was sending that word out, more messages were coming in, clarifying the situation, which also had to be relayed. He had to notify the watch office at Mare Island that there was an attack on Pearl Harbor. They had to recall personnel. I mean, things were getting pretty exciting. So needless to say, he never had lunch that day. After he relayed the word of the attack to Washington, D.C., Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State, was in his office waiting. He was in his office waiting for a Japanese delegation to bring their response to the President of the United States to a peace proposal that had been made about 2 weeks before. Cordell Hull already knew what that response was going to be because we had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. So he had already seen the information. He was just going through the motions. And as he was still waiting, in came this message from Mare Island: attack on Pearl Harbor. So I really wanted to find out exactly what happened in that meeting, and I wasn't able to. But I can imagine he probably had to sit there and listen to the Japanese go through this big, long, communique, and finally break off negotiations with the United States so that they wouldn't know that we'd broken their codes, all the while knowing that they had attacked Pearl Harbor. His response to the Japanese as they left was, "I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them." Meanwhile, back at Mare Island, Van Dayton was swamped with message traffic. Just in that first day, he received word of American ships torpedoed off of San Francisco, of additional Japanese attacks that were launched against Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippine Islands, Wake Island, and Midway Island. So you put yourself in the shoes of people as this information became available in the next day, and what they must have been thinking. I mean, it was as if the Japanese were overrunning the Pacific, and we had just lost our fleet. And as Joanne mentioned, by the next morning, Congress declared war on Japan. Nearly 6,000 Americans lie dead or wounded in Pearl Harbor. Incidentally, of those wounded, a number of them arrived at the hospital on Mare Island on Christmas Day of 1941. The lives of every American were irrevocably changed. As we entered World War II. And by the end of World War II, the casualty count would grow to over 1 million. So you didn't live during this period without being influenced by this war. And one of the other things I just wanted to mention, if you were here looking across the channel back then, you would have seen these huge radio towers that dominated the whole south end of the Napa Valley. That's where the messages came in. And as the days went on, Mare Island mobilized. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, there were 10,000 people working at Mare Island. It had been slowly mobilizing since Roosevelt declared a limited state of emergency and finally an unlimited state of emergency, going back to 1939. But by the end of the war, there were 44,000 people working at Mare Island. But throughout the United States, during that war, there were over 4,000 ships built. Here in the Bay Area, 40% of the ships were built. The north end of Mare Island was barren when the war war started. A year later, they were launching ships that had them lined up on building ways that didn't exist before. Sausalito, some of the tidelands in Sausalito became marine ship. Richmond shipyards. Down in Alameda, you can still see the old building ways. So the bottom line is the Bay Area became the largest shipbuilding complex in the world. And of those 4,000 ships, 20% of the combatants were built here in the Bay Area. 50% of the non-combatants were built in the Bay Area. This place was humming. So the purpose of this exhibit is to commemorate that moment. Now the neat thing, I have a hard time not turning away from the microphone. So the neat thing is, the communication building in the old headquarters that sits up above Alden Park, this equipment came from there. It's equipment that was used and received that message on December 7th. The little clicker, and you can come up and look at it afterwards. The little clicker you use to send Morse code, that was owned by Van Dayton. Van Dayton was the lead telegrapher. That is the clicker that was used. They call it a bud. That was used when the message was received to relay the message to Washington, D.C., and to the 12th Naval District here on the Pacific Coast, and all the different commands. And that message went out about a half hour before the news media got a hold of it, and that was when the thing started to hit the papers as they learned more and more about what happened. So what I'd like to ask you to do for just one moment is to remember the millions of people who died during that war with a moment of silence. Thank you for coming, and I really appreciate your interest.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm sure we all learned a lot from your presentation today. The equipment is very compelling. The teletype, the typewriter that's here, if you try to heft it, it weighs about 40 pounds. If you can imagine that being in an office building and having to be moved from one desk to another, all the equipment is very heavy. And it's marked as you were told, as the authentic equipment that was used during the receipt of that message. There's a lot of good history, some of which Dennis mentioned, some that I think you'll find interesting if you take the time to read it. But I'll echo what Dennis said and thank all of you for coming today. Thank Ryan and Kent also for making their establishment available to us. As Kent mentioned earlier, the bar is open, so if you want to grab a libation and while you're perusing the exhibit, that's fine. The other thing is the exhibit, if you know of somebody that might be interested in looking at it, is going to be on display through the weekend. So Saturday and Sunday, you can either come back yourself or send a friend, and then starting next week, it'll be moved over to the Mare Island Museum, and I'm sure that most people know where that is. It's the old pipe shop, Building 46, and the way people are going to probably be describing it, it's right next to Savage and Cook Distillery. that gives them something they can grab a hold of to bring them to the right place. Any comments from anybody? Dennis can probably answer questions, but again, I just want to echo his thanks and thanks on the behalf of the Mare Island Historic Park Foundation, and thank you, Joanne, for sharing your eventful December 7th, 1941. I guess I feel compelled to tell. I was just a toddler when the war was going on, but we lived over in Federal Terrace, up on the hill, overlooking Bay Terrace, and probably a couple hundred yards from the Napa Street. Mare Island Strait at that time. And my friends around the neighborhood, well, the neat thing we thought we saw, you'd go out in your backyard and here were all these blimps tethered to the concrete blocks right down the street from us. And those, of course, were the barrage balloons. But we really thought that was pretty neat to be able to go outside our door and see these blimps. And that was pretty neat until one exploded because they were full of hydrogen. And the one that exploded was about 2 blocks away. And the cracker boxes that the government built for their workers to live in couldn't withstand something like that. 2 of the units, there were 2 duplexes, were flattened completely. They probably took a roof off of another half a dozen, and we were 2 blocks away, and it broke all the windows on the side of the house that faced the explosion. So there were, I have a few recollections. That one definitely was the most vivid because. Oh, I will say this. My dad had gone to, this happened about 9 o'clock in the morning. My dad had gone to work, and when my dad went to work, then I'd climb out of my single bed in my room and go climb in the big double bed with my mom. And she said when the explosion went off and the window slammed and the glass broke all over everything, I sat up in bed and I'll just say, I uttered an explicative that when my dad got home from work, she said, Bruce is picking up the wrong dialogue from us. and so she says, we're going to have to watch ourselves when we're talking in front of him. So at any rate, that was one of my recollections. And of course, when you're a preschooler, you don't remember a lot of things. But that one, definitely, I don't remember the expletive, but she repeated it to me and told me I better straighten up. Yes?
What were those blimps for?
They were barrage balloons, and what they would do, they'd tether them up 150, 200 yards in the air, and they were to keep aircraft from coming in low and being able